Mistakes usually cost a few bucks: a burnt dinner, a parking ticket left out in the rain. Wyatt's mistake was going to cost him rent, groceries, and the fragile, duct-taped stability he'd bled to build for his 6-year-old son. He meant to send a simple, exhausted text of affection to his sister before passing out on a mattress that smelled of stale milk. Instead, his thumb slipped. 3 words, sent into the digital void, delivered straight to the personal cell phone of the most ruthless, untouchable woman in corporate America. His boss, cherry syrup. That was the smell of rock bottom. Wyatt scrubbed a hand down his face, his palm catching on 3 days of coarse stubble. His knuckles were raw from washing dishes in water that was too hot, the cheap lemon soap eating away at his skin. Across the cramped living room, the digital clock on the microwave flickered. 11:42 p.m. On the sagging plaid sofa, Toby was finally asleep. The boy's breathing was a wet, heavy rattle, but the fever had broken 20 minutes ago. An empty plastic dosing cup sat on the coffee table, ringed with dried, sticky red liquid. Wyatt's spine popped as he leaned back against the cheap vinyl of the kitchen chair. He felt hollowed out, entirely consumed by the low-level panic that dictated every hour of a single father's life. His bank account was currently sitting at $34. Payday wasn't until Friday. Toby needed new sneakers because his toes were curling in his current pair, and the radiator in the hallway clanked with a metallic screech that meant it was going to fail before February. He dug his phone out of his jeans pocket. The screen was a chaotic spiderweb of cracked glass, the result of Toby dropping it on the concrete steps outside Toby's elementary school 2 months ago. Replacing the screen cost $80. Wyatt didn't have $80. He opened his messages. He needed to text his older sister Hannah. She was the only reason he hadn't completely capsized the one who had dropped off the medicine earlier that evening, when Wyatt couldn't afford the copay at the pharmacy. His vision was blurring, a persistent throbbing ache nested right behind his left eye. He squinted at the shattered screen, navigating through his recent messages. Earlier that day, the company's servers had suffered a massive localized failure. As a mid-level data architect for Vanguard Logistics, Wyatt had been part of the emergency response team. He had spent 6 hours in a windowless room that smelled of ozone and stale sweat roting emergency communications. He had been forced to use the emergency directory, placing the CEO's direct line in his recent contacts to forward an automated damage assessment report. He didn't register the name at the top of the thread. He just saw the grey icon, his exhausted brain misfiring, assuming the last person he was thinking about was the one queued up on the screen. His thumbs moved clumsily over the cracked glass. Fever finally broke. "I love you. Get some sleep." He hit send. The little green arrow swooshed upward. Wyatt let his head fall back against the wall, closing his eyes, listening to the hum of the ancient refrigerator. He waited for the familiar buzz of Hannah's reply. Usually it was a string of heart emojis or a simple "thank God." 30 seconds passed. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, thick with dust and exhaustion. He opened his eyes and looked down at the glowing screen. The name at the top wasn't Hannah. It read, Sloane Harper. Wyatt's heart stopped. It didn't stutter or skip a beat. It simply ceased to function. The blood drained from his face so fast, he felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. His stomach inverted. He stared at the screen. The text bubble sat there, bright and damning. "I love you. Get some sleep." Beneath it, in tiny, merciless grey letters, read 11:44 p.m. No. Wyatt breathed out the sound barely more than a rasp. No, no, no. His fingers scrambled over the glass, slicing the pad of his index finger on a sharp edge of the crack as he frantically tried to find an unsend button that didn't exist on his outdated operating system. He tried to delete it. He swiped. He pressed. He nearly snapped the device in half. It was gone. It was red. Sloane Harper, the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a woman who was less a human being and more a localized weather event. She was 38, a self-made billionaire who had built a supply chain empire by systematically dismantling her competitors with the cold, unfeeling precision of a surgeon. She didn't do small talk. She didn't do office parties. Wyatt had been in the same room as her exactly twice in 3 years. Both times the air pressure in the room had physically shifted. She smelled of expensive bergamot and ink, and she spoke in a voice that was quiet, flat, and absolutely terrifying. Last year, she fired the head of operations in the middle of a crowded lobby because he stuttered through a quarterly forecast. And Wyatt, a nobody in the data basement, had just texted her, "I love you." He stood up so fast the chair scraped violently against the linoleum. Toby stirred on the couch, whimpering softly. Wyatt froze, holding his breath until the boy settled back into a deep sleep. Wyatt looked down at his phone again. Still just that one red receipt. Now who is this no wrong number? Just read. He walked to the tiny kitchen sink and gripped the cold porcelain edges. His reflection in the dark window pane above the sink looked like a ghost. He was dead. His career was dead. The $34 in his bank account would be his severance. HR would have a field day. Sexual harassment. Inappropriate conduct. They wouldn't care that it was a mistake. Sloane Harper didn't tolerate mistakes. He turned the tap on and splashed freezing water over his face. The cold didn't help. He smelled the metallic tang of his own blood where the phone had cut his finger. He had to fix this. He picked up the phone, ignoring the blood smearing the screen. He began to type. "Ms. Harper? I am so incredibly sorry. That message was meant for my sister. My son has been sick, and I am operating on 0 sleep. Please disregard. My deepest apologies." He hovered his thumb over the send button. He stared at it. If he sent that he was confirming it was him. Right now it was just a number she might not have saved. But the automated report he sent earlier had his employee ID attached to it. She knew. Or her assistant knew. He deleted the apology. He typed it again. He deleted it again. At 2 a.m., the screen went dark. The battery had died. Wyatt slid down the kitchen cabinets and sat on the cold floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He didn't sleep. He just sat there, listening to the rain start to beat against the single-pane window, waiting for the morning to come and burn his life to the ground. Morning tasted like copper and burnt coffee. Wyatt walked through the glass revolving doors of the Vanguard Logistics building at exactly 7:50 a.m. The lobby was a cathedral of intimidation, acres of white marble, brushed steel, and security guards who looked like off-duty mercenaries. The air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like walking into a meat locker. His clothes felt wrong. He was wearing his best shirt, a light blue button-down, but the collar was fraying, and it smelled faintly of the cheap detergent he bought in bulk. Beside him, executives glided past in bespoke wool suits that cost more than his car, leaving wakes of expensive cologne. He scanned his badge at the turnstile. It beeped green. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They haven't deactivated it yet. He rode the elevator down to the 4th floor. The data division. It was a vast, open-plan floor filled with rows of identical grey desks, bathed in the sickly hum of fluorescent lights that gave everyone a permanent jaundiced pallor. Wyatt sat at his desk. His neighbor, a guy named David, who constantly chewed on plastic stir sticks, gave him a nod. "You look like hell, man," David said, his eyes glued to his dual monitors. Toby was sick. Wyatt lied. Well, it wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. "Kids are petri dishes," David muttered, snapping a stir stick between his teeth. Wyatt booted up his computer. He opened his email. He expected to see a calendar invite from HR, mandatory meeting termination of employment. Nothing. Just spam and newsletter from the cafeteria and 3 automated server logs. He plugged his phone into his computer tower to charge it. When the cracked screen flickered to life, he immediately opened his messages. The thread with Sloane Harper was right at the top. "I love you. Get some sleep. Read 11:44 p.m. Still no reply. Every time a phone rang on the floor, Wyatt flinched. Every time the heavy double doors at the end of the aisle opened, his stomach clenched, expecting security to march down and hand him a cardboard box. By 11 a.m., the suspense was physical torture. He couldn't concentrate on the SQL code blurring across his screen. His jaw ached from clenching it. He went to the break room to get water. The water cooler bubbled violently as he filled a paper cup. He heard footsteps behind him. Sharp, precise, high heels on the industrial carpet. He turned the paper cup crushing in his grip water, spilling over his knuckles. It was just an intern from marketing carrying a stack of files. She gave him a weird look and hurried past. Wyatt threw the wet, ruined cup into the trash. He was losing his mind. Why hadn't she fired him? Was she making HR build an ironclad case? Was she waiting for the end of the day on Friday to do it? The classic corporate execution time. Today was Thursday. He had to survive another 30 hours of this. At 2 p.m., his desk phone rang. Not his cell. The heavy black Cisco phone that only ever rang for internal transfers. The red light blinked like an emergency siren. David stopped chewing his stir stick and glanced over. "You gonna answer that?" Wyatt wiped his sweating palms on his jeans. He picked up the receiver. "Wyatt speaking." "Wyatt?" The voice was female, crisp, professional. It wasn't Sloane. "This is HR," the voice said. Wyatt closed his eyes. "Here it is." "Yes. We need you to sign off on the updated medical insurance waivers by tomorrow. You haven't submitted your digital signature yet." Wyatt stared blankly at his monitor. The waivers? Yes. Check your spam folder. Have it done by Friday, please." Click. He slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. He felt dizzy. The rest of the day dissolved into a blur of raw nerves and caffeine shakes. He left the building at 5:05 p.m., blending into the herd of exhausted employees pouring out onto the wet pavement of the city. He rode the subway home, trapped between a man smelling heavily of garlic and a teenager playing music loudly through leaky headphones. Wyatt stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the train doors. He looked older than 32. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He picked Toby up from the downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who watched him for a few extra dollars a week. Toby was still pale, clutching a stuffed dog that had lost an ear to the laundromat a year ago. "He ate half a sandwich," Mrs. Gable said, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Still a bit warm, but better." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Wyatt said, handing her a crumpled $10 bill. It was a third of his remaining cash. That night, back in their apartment, the routine took over, numbing his panic slightly. Macaroni on the stove, the smell of artificial cheese powder masking the scent of the damp drywall. He ran Toby a bath, checking the temperature with his elbow. He read 3 pages of a book about trucks before Toby fell asleep mid-sentence. Wyatt washed the dishes. He scrubbed the pot until his knuckles bled again from the old cut. He checked his phone. Nothing. Friday was worse. The anticipation had curdled into a dark, cynical resignation. He went to work expecting the axe to fall. He packed his few personal belongings, a framed photo of Toby, a cheap novelty mug, into his backpack before his shift started. But 5 p.m. came and went. Nobody called, nobody emailed. He walked out of the building on Friday night, feeling a strange, hollow sense of survival. Maybe she really hadn't cared. Maybe she got hundreds of weird texts a day and just ignored them. Or maybe she recognized it as a misfire and miraculously chose not to ruin a man's life over it. He breathed in the cold night air. It smelled like exhaust fumes and damp concrete, but to Wyatt it smelled like freedom. He was safe. He still had a job. He had no idea how wrong he was. Saturday evening settled over the city like a wet grey blanket. The rain had been falling since noon, a relentless drizzle that made the cheap siding of Wyatt's apartment building look even more decayed. Inside, the radiator was clanking out its chaotic rhythm. The apartment smelled of the frozen pizza Wyatt had burned the edges of, masking the faint, persistent odor of mildew from the bathroom. Toby was on the rug, surrounded by a fortress of mismatched Legos, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. Wyatt was at the tiny kitchen table, hunched over a stack of bills. The harsh yellow light from the overhead fixture illuminated the grim arithmetic of his life. Electric, water, rent. He was short. Again. He rubbed his temples, feeling the dull headache returning. Then came the sound. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a tentative tap. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a delivery driver. It was 3 sharp, measured strikes against the thin wood of his front door. It carried an unnatural weight. Wyatt looked up. The clock read 8:15 p.m. "Dad, someone's at the door," Toby said, not looking up from his Legos. "I hear it, buddy," Wyatt muttered, pushing his chair back. It scraped loudly against the linoleum. He walked down the short, narrow hallway. The carpet under his bare feet felt gritty. He assumed it was the landlord coming to complain about the trash bags Wyatt had left by the stairs, or maybe Mrs. Gable needing help with a jar. He unlocked the deadbolt. The lock mechanism stuck, requiring him to jiggle it violently before it gave way with a loud clack. He pulled the door open. The breath instantly evacuated Wyatt's lungs. Standing in the dim, flickering light of the hallway was Sloane Harper. She looked entirely incongruous, like a piece of high-end modern art dropped into a landfill. She wore a long, tailored black cashmere coat that fell past her knees, pristine despite the weather outside. The collar was turned up slightly against her neck. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot, though a few stray strands were damp with rain. She wasn't looking at his face. Her eyes, a sharp, unreadable brown, were currently sweeping over the peeling paint of the doorframe, the water stain on the ceiling behind him, the cheap scuff marks on the wall. Wyatt's vocal cords paralyzed. He gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white. He felt a sudden, violent urge to slam the door shut and lock it. Finally, her gaze shifted. She looked him dead in the eyes. She didn't look angry. She didn't look disgusted. She looked intensely analytical, like she was reading a line of bad code and trying to figure out how it had bypassed the firewall. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the clanking of the radiator and the muffled noise of the television from a neighbor's apartment. "Wyatt," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered from the few times he had heard her speak in the distance. Low, even. It didn't carry, it penetrated. Ms. Harper Wyatt managed to choke out. His voice cracked like a teenager's. He cleared his throat, feeling a hot flush of deep, humiliating shame creep up his neck. He was wearing faded grey sweatpants and a t-shirt that had a hole near the hem. He smelled like burnt pepperoni. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped forward. Wyatt instinctively stepped back, giving way as she crossed the threshold into his apartment. The air shifted immediately. The smell of cheap pizza was suddenly overpowered by the scent of petrichor cold wool and something sharp and expensive, like crushed leaves and citrus. She stopped in the middle of the narrow entryway, her expensive leather boots resting on the frayed edge of his welcome mat. "Close the door," she said. It wasn't a request. Wyatt slowly closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in his ears. He leaned against the wood, trapping himself. Sloane turned, slowly taking in the living room. She saw the sagging couch. She saw the flickering microwave clock. And then she saw Toby. Toby looked up from his Legos. He stared at the strange, tall woman in the dark coat. "Hi," Toby said, his voice small but curious. Sloane stared at the boy. For a fraction of a second, the severe line of her mouth faltered. A micro-expression, a twitch of something that might have been surprise or discomfort. Then it vanished, smoothed over by the icy veneer that had made her billions. "Hello," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral. She turned back to Wyatt. She closed the distance between them, stepping into his personal space. She was taller than him in her heels. She stood so close he could see the microscopic droplets of rainwater resting on the collar of her coat. He could feel the cold radiating off the damp fabric. Wyatt's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He opened his mouth to apologize, to beg for his job, to explain the exhaustion and the cracked screen. Before he could form a single word, she leaned in. Her face was inches from his. The smell of bergamot was intoxicating, dizzying. She didn't yell. She didn't fire him. She lowered her voice until it was nothing more than a raspy, terrifying whisper that only he could hear over the clanking radiator. "Do you have any idea?" She breathed the words, carrying the weight of a physical threat. "What it feels like to have a man text you those words when you haven't slept in 3 days?" Wyatt froze. His eyes widened, locking onto hers. There was a dangerous, volatile energy in her gaze, a deep contradiction that shattered the untouchable facade. Wyatt stammered, his mind short-circuiting. "You terrified my security team." She whispered, her eyes dark and fixed on his mouth before snapping back to his eyes. "You completely derailed a board meeting. And worse." She paused, her jaw tightening, as if the admission physically pained her. "You made me curious, and I absolutely despise being curious about my employees." She stepped back, the sudden removal of her presence, leaving a cold void in the cramped hallway. "Put some shoes on," she commanded, her voice returning to its normal, authoritative volume. Wyatt blinked, completely unmoored. "What?" Sloane looked at Toby, then back to Wyatt. "Get a babysitter. You have exactly 10 minutes before I lose my patience." I can't afford." Wyatt started, gesturing helplessly toward the kitchen table and the stack of bills. Sloane reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a sleek black leather card holder. She extracted a crisp $100 bill and held it out between 2 manicured fingers. "Pay Mrs. Gable downstairs," Sloane said. "Her door is 2B correct. She usually watches him on Thursdays." Wyatt stared at the bill, then at Sloane, a cold sweat breaking out across his back. She knew about Mrs. Gable. She had investigated him. 10 minutes, Wyatt," she repeated softly, "or I will fire you right here in front of the kid." Panic has a distinct, metallic taste. It coated the back of Wyatt's throat as he sprinted down the narrow, poorly lit stairwell to the second floor, the crisp $100 bill burning a hole in his sweaty palm. He banged on Mrs. Gable's door, his knuckles throbbing. When she opened it, squinting through thick bifocals and smelling of lavender soap and old paperbacks, Wyatt shoved the money at her. He stumbled through a half-coherent lie about an emergency server crash, promising he'd be back before morning. 10 minutes later, he was stepping off the cracked curb into the driving rain, his cheap canvas sneakers immediately soaking through. A black car idled at the edge of the street, massive and predatory. It wasn't just a car. It was a vault on wheels, its tinted windows absorbing the sickly orange glow of the street lamps. The rear door was already open. Wyatt slid into the back seat, the door pulling itself shut with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud that instantly severed them from the noise of the city. The silence inside was absolute. It was jarring. He sank into leather that felt softer than human skin. The air inside smelled of ozone-polished wood and that same sharp, expensive bergamot. Sloane sat on the opposite side of the spacious cabin, staring straight ahead at the glass partition separating them from the driver. "Drive, David," she said. Her voice didn't need to be loud. An intercom carried it crisply to the front. The massive vehicle pulled away from the curb without a single vibration. Wyatt sat rigidly, his wet canvas shoes ruining the pristine lamb's wool floor mats. He felt aggressively out of place, a stain on a perfect canvas. He hugged his damp thrift store jacket tighter around his chest, acutely aware of the frayed cuffs and the faint, lingering scent of Toby's cough syrup on his sleeve. "Where are we going?" Wyatt asked. His voice sounded thin, stripped of all authority. Sloane didn't turn her head. The neon lights of the passing storefronts washed over her sharp profile, casting long, moving shadows across her face. "I haven't decided yet." Wyatt swallowed hard. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm. "Look, Miss Harper, if you're going to fire me, just do it. Don't play games. I have a kid. I have rent. I can't do whatever this is. If I wanted to fire you, Wyatt, I would have had HR do it on Thursday morning," she replied, finally turning her head. Her dark eyes swept over him, dissecting his anxiety. "I don't play games with payroll. I find it vulgar." "Then why did you show up at my apartment?" She looked away, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. The muscles in her jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers from the front cab. "You disrupted my ecosystem," she said quietly. It sounded like an accusation. "My life is meticulously categorized. Good investments, bad investments, acceptable losses, calculated risks." And then at 11:44 p.m. on a Wednesday, a mid-level data architect sent a nuclear warhead into my personal sanctuary. Wyatt rubbed a trembling hand over his face, feeling the rough grit of his own exhaustion. "It was an accident. I was trying to text my sister. The screen is cracked. I was operating on 2 hours of sleep." "I know," Sloane said. "I had my security detail pull your background file by 1 a.m. that night. Hannah, 35, pediatric nurse. You are the sole custodian of Tobias, age 6. Your bank account is perpetually hovering near overdraft. You buy generic brand groceries. You haven't taken a sick day in 3 years. Wyatt felt a cold spike of violation pierce through his fear. "You looked into my bank account." "I looked into everything," she stated flatly, as if discussing a quarterly earnings report. "I needed to know if it was corporate espionage, a bizarre extortion attempt, a mental breakdown." She shifted slightly the cashmere of her coat, whispering against the leather seat. She leaned closer to him, the ambient light from the street revealing a startling exhaustion beneath her immaculate makeup. "Do you know what I found instead, Wyatt?" she asked, her voice dropping a fraction. Wyatt shook his head, his throat too dry to speak. "I found a man who was drowning," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "A man who was completely submerged in debt stress and desperation. And yet, sitting in the dark with $30 to his name, his first instinct was to tell someone he loved them, to tell them to get some sleep." She let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a dry, bitter laugh. It was sickeningly earnest. It defied every algorithm I use to understand human behavior. I'm sorry my misery fascinated you." Wyatt snapped, the sheer indignity of the situation finally overriding his terror. He was poor, not a zoo animal. Sloane's eyes flared, a sudden spark of genuine heat cutting through the ice. "It didn't fascinate me, it paralyzed me." Before Wyatt could process that, the car plunged into the steep concrete ramp of an underground parking garage. The neon lights vanished, replaced by the harsh, flickering strobes of subterranean security. The car rolled to a stop in a private, roped-off section next to a bank of stainless steel elevators. "Get out," Sloane ordered, the vulnerability from a moment ago snapping shut like a steel trap. The elevator ride was silent, a high-speed ascent that made Wyatt's ears pop. He watched the digital numbers above the door blur past 50, 60, 70. When the doors slid open, they didn't reveal a hallway. They opened directly into a sprawling, aggressively modern penthouse. It was a cathedral of cold wealth, floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a vertigo-inducing view of the city, below a sea of glittering diamonds drowning in the rain. The floors were polished concrete, the furniture sharp angles of black leather and chrome. It smelled like cedar, expensive gin, and absolute crushing loneliness. There wasn't a single personal item in sight, no photos, no misplaced coffee mugs, no discarded jackets. It looked like a museum exhibit titled "Billionaire Late 21st Century." Sloane walked past him, shedding her heavy cashmere coat and dropping it carelessly over the back of a white sofa. Underneath, she wore a tailored black turtleneck and high-waisted trousers. She moved with a feline grace to a massive backlit marble bar. "Drink?" she asked, grabbing a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. "No," Wyatt said. He remained standing awkwardly by the elevator doors, dripping rainwater onto the concrete. "I want to know what I'm doing here. I'm off the clock, Ms. Harper. If this isn't about my employment, then this is kidnapping." Sloane poured a heavy measure of scotch into a glass. She didn't add ice. She turned and leaned against the marble counter, taking a slow sip. The amber liquid cast a golden reflection against her pale throat as she swallowed. "You aren't kidnapped," she said quietly. "The elevator isn't locked. You can press the lobby button right now and walk out." Wyatt stared at her. He looked at the glowing button panel. He could leave. He should leave. But his feet felt nailed to the floor. The chaotic magnetic pull of the situation held him hostage. "Then why am I here?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Sloane set the glass down. The crystal made a sharp, definitive clink against the marble. She walked slowly toward him, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the faint, violet shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, shadows that matched his own. "Because," Sloane began, her voice tight, "when I read that text, I was sitting in a boardroom in Tokyo. It was 1 p.m. local time. I was in the middle of hostile negotiations to acquire a shipping fleet. I had 3 lawyers screaming at me, a migraine splitting my skull, and I hadn't slept a full night in 6 months." She crossed her arms defensively, a sudden, profoundly human gesture that looked entirely out of place on her. My phone buzzed. She continued, her gaze dropping to the wet collar of his jacket. A direct text. I expected a disaster, a fire at a warehouse, a stock crash. I opened it. She looked back up and Wyatt saw it. A fracture, a tiny, jagged crack in the porcelain mask of the CEO. "I love you." "Get some sleep." She recited the words, sounding foreign and delicate on her tongue. "Do you know how long it has been since someone told me to sleep, since someone cared about my basic biological needs without wanting a percentage of my company in return?" Wyatt stood, frozen, his breath hitching. "Ms. Harper." "Sloane," she corrected sharply. "In this room, it's Sloane." Sloane Wyatt amended the name, feeling heavy and dangerous in his mouth. It was a mistake, a typo. It wasn't real. I know it wasn't real. She snapped her voice, suddenly echoing off the glass walls, harsh and violent. She took a step closer, crowding him, her scent enveloping him entirely. Do you think I'm delusional? I know you don't love me. You don't even know me. You're terrified of me. Every time I walk past your desk, you stop breathing. I can hear it. Wyatt swallowed his throat, clicking audibly. He felt exposed, stripped down to his nerves. Then what do you want from me? Sloane reached out. Wyatt flinched instinctively, anticipating a strike, a push, something aggressive. Instead, her hand, cool and remarkably soft, rested against the lapel of his cheap, damp jacket. He felt the heat of her palm seeping through the thin canvas, burning into his chest. I wanted to see the man who sent it. She whispered, her eyes wide, searching his face with a frantic, uncharacteristic desperation. I wanted to look at you and prove to myself that you were just an idiot who made a typo. I wanted to fire you, ruin you, and erase the anomaly. Her thumb brushed lightly against the rough fabric of his collar. Wyatt's breath hitched. His body, starved of any touch that wasn't a crying child clinging to him, betrayed him by leaning imperceptibly into her warmth. But I went to your apartment. Sloane murmured, her gaze dropping to his mouth again, the internal war raging visibly behind her eyes. I smelled the burnt pizza. I saw the cheap toys. I saw the way you looked at that door when I knocked, ready to fight whatever landlord or debt collector was on the other side. She stepped even closer. There was barely an inch between them now. Wyatt could feel the ambient heat of her body. His pulse was roaring in his ears, deafening him to the sound of the rain beating against the glass. You aren't an anomaly, she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of all its corporate polish. You're real, and I hate it. Wyatt's instinct for survival was screaming at him to run. This was a trap. This was a billionaire playing with a broken toy she found in the gutter. If he crossed this line, if he acknowledged the bizarre electric tension crackling in the air between them, there was no going back to the data basement. There was no going back to his quiet, desperate life. But anger, deep and protective, suddenly flared in his chest, burning away the fear. He reached up and grabbed her wrist. Sloane gasped a sharp, genuine sound of shock. Nobody grabbed her. Nobody touched her without express contractual permission. Wyatt's grip was firm, his calloused fingers wrapping around the delicate bones of her wrist. He pulled her hand off his chest, but he didn't let go. He held her hand suspended between them. You hate it, Wyatt growled, his voice dropping an octave raw and thick with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. You hate that I'm real. You think this is a game. You think my life is some kind of poverty tourism for you. Sloane stared at him, her eyes wide, her lips parted slightly. She tried to pull her wrist back, a weak, reflexive tug. But Wyatt held fast. The dynamic in the room had shifted violently. He was no longer the terrified employee. He was a cornered animal, and he was finally baring his teeth. I spend every single day of my life terrified, Wyatt said, stepping forward, forcing Sloane to take a half step back. Terrified that Toby will get sick, and I won't afford the medicine. Terrified that the car will break down. Terrified that I'll make a mistake at a job I hate, run by a woman who fires people for stuttering. He squeezed her wrist slightly, leaning down until they were eye to eye. He could smell the scotch on her breath, mixing with the bergamot. You have billions of dollars. Wyatt spat the words, tasting like acid. You have the world at your feet. You could buy an island and sleep for a decade, but you're so empty inside that a misdirected text from a desperate nobody brings you to your knees. That's pathetic, Sloane. The use of her first name, spat with such venom, struck her like a physical blow. Sloane's chest heaved. The icy armor didn't just crack. It shattered, falling away in jagged, dangerous pieces. Her eyes blazed not with corporate anger, but with something entirely primal and raw. "Don't you dare judge me," she breathed, her voice shaking violently. "You have no idea what it takes to build what I have. You have no idea the blood I've spilled, the parts of myself I've had to amputate just to survive in rooms full of men who want to tear me apart. I don't care about your boardrooms," Wyatt yelled, the sound shocking him, shocking her. "I care about my son. I care about paying rent. You dragged me here to make yourself feel something, to play some twisted psychological game. Well, I'm not playing." He released her wrist so abruptly, she stumbled back a step. Wyatt turned his back on her, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He walked toward the elevator. He hammered the glowing call button with the heel of his hand. Ding. The stainless steel doors slid open smoothly. Wyatt stepped inside. He turned around to face the penthouse. Sloane was standing exactly where he left her. She looked small. For the first time since he had known of her existence, Sloane Harper looked entirely devastatingly human. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her own ribs, holding herself together. The elevator doors began to close. "Wyatt," it wasn't a command. It was a plea, a fractured, desperate sound that scraped against the polished concrete. Wyatt froze. The doors were sliding shut, narrowing his view of her. He saw a single tear break free from her dark lashes, tracing a shining path down her pale cheek before catching the neon light from the window. He slammed his hand against the rubber sensor of the door. The doors violently reversed, sliding back open with a mechanical protest. Wyatt stepped out of the elevator. He didn't think. The rational calculating part of his brain, the data architect that measured risk and reward, was completely offline. He was acting entirely on the visceral magnetic pull of the damage he recognized in her eyes. It mirrored his own. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long, predatory strides. Sloane looked up, her breath catching in her throat as he invaded her space once more. The fear was back in her eyes, but it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what was about to happen. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He reached out his rough, raw hands, framing her face. Her skin was incredibly soft cold from the ambient air of the massive room. She shuddered violently at the contact, a full-body tremor that rippled through the expensive fabric of her clothes. "You're empty," Wyatt whispered fiercely, his thumbs tracing the sharp lines of her cheekbones, wiping away the single tear. "But so am I." Sloane let out a ragged gasp. Her hands flew up, not to push him away, but to grip his jacket, her manicured fingers digging frantically into the cheap canvas as if he were the only solid object in a collapsing building. She pulled him down. The kiss was in collision. There was nothing gentle or romantic about it. It was a violent clash of teeth and desperate seeking mouths. It tasted of expensive Scotch rain and the metallic tang of shared adrenaline. Wyatt's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, feeling the frantic hummingbird flutter of her heart against his ribs. Sloane made a soft, broken sound in the back of her throat. Her hands moved from his jacket, sliding up to fist in his damp hair, anchoring him to her. She kissed him like she was starving, like he was oxygen, and she had been drowning for a decade. The sheer, overwhelming force of her need shocked him, fueling his own suppressed desperation. He backed her up, their bodies entangled in a chaotic, clumsy dance, until her spine hit the cool marble of the bar. Wyatt broke the kiss, gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers. They were both breathing heavily, the sound ragged and loud in the cavernous, empty penthouse. Sloane's eyes remained closed. Her hands were still tangled in his hair, her grip trembling. "This is a disaster," She whispered the words, brushing against his lips. Wyatt opened his eyes, looking down at the billionaire CEO, currently clinging to him like a lifeline. He felt the heavy, undeniable truth of her words sink into his bones. "I know." Wyatt rasped his hands, sliding down to grip her hips, anchoring her against him. "Fire me tomorrow." Sloane opened her eyes, a dark, chaotic fire burning in them. "I'm going to ruin your life, Wyatt." Wyatt let out a low, cynical laugh that held absolutely no humor. He pulled her back in, capturing her mouth once more. "It was already ruined," he murmured against her lips. "At least this way it won't be boring." Sunday morning arrived with the sterile, unforgiving glare of a surgical lamp. Wyatt dragged his eyes open. The light in the penthouse was blinding, a harsh white, bouncing off miles of reinforced glass and polished concrete. His neck screamed in protest, locked at a brutal angle against the stiff, unyielding armrest of the minimalist white sofa. He was still wearing his cheap jacket, the damp canvas now dried into stiff, uncomfortable wrinkles. He sat up, rubbing the grit from his eyes. His mouth tasted of stale scotch and old adrenaline. The memory of the night before hit him with the physical force of a subway train. The shouting, the desperate, violent kiss against the marble bar. The way she had eventually collapsed against him, her manicured fingers twisting into his shirt as the exhaustion finally overtook her manic energy. They hadn't made it to a bedroom. They hadn't even taken their clothes off. They had simply burned out 2 frayed wires, sparking until the fuse blew, falling asleep on the couch in a tangle of limbs and defensive walls. The spot next to him was empty. The cushion was cold. "I prefer my coffee black, but I assumed you'd need sugar." Wyatt jumped, his heart spiking. He snapped his head toward the kitchen island. Sloane was standing there. The vulnerability of the previous night had been entirely scrubbed away, locked back behind a vault of unimaginable wealth and routine. She was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit, her hair slicked back into that severe, unyielding knot. She looked sharp enough to draw blood. She slid a matte black ceramic mug across the marble counter. Wyatt stood up. His joints ached. He felt acutely aware of his unbrushed teeth, the heavy stubble on his jaw, and the lingering scent of his own dried sweat. He looked at the digital clock embedded in the oven. 8:14 a.m. Panic seized him by the throat. "Toby, Mrs. Gable only agreed to stay until morning. I sent my driver David to your apartment an hour ago," Sloane said smoothly, taking a sip from her own mug. Her eyes were completely unreadable over the rim. "He delivered a basket of expensive pastries from a bakery in Chelsea, and $200 in an unmarked envelope to Mrs. Gable. She believes you were locked in a server room, handling a critical data breach." Wyatt stopped halfway to the counter. He stared at her, the sheer, casual manipulation of it, making his stomach turn. She had fixed his crisis with pocket change, and a driver neutralizing the messy reality of his life without breaking a sweat. "You can't do that," Wyatt rasped, his voice thick with sleep and anger. "You can't just throw money at my neighbors and invent stories about my life." Sloane set her mug down. The ceramic made a sharp, authoritative clack. "I protected my employees' privacy. Would you prefer she knew you were asleep on your boss's sofa?" "I'd prefer you didn't treat my life like a PR crisis," he shot back. He walked past the coffee, heading straight for the elevator. He didn't look at her. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt suffocating, pumped full of filtered, temperature-controlled oxygen that tasted like nothing. "Wyatt!" He stopped at the steel doors. He didn't turn around. "Tomorrow is Monday," Sloane said. Her voice was flat, but he could hear the microscopic tremor beneath the surface, the same tremor he had felt in her hands the night before. "You will arrive at work at your scheduled time. You will not speak of this. You will not look at me differently when I walk the floor. This anomaly is contained. Wyatt pressed the call button. The red circle illuminated. "You're terrified," he said quietly to the steel doors. "I am pragmatic." She corrected her tone, hardening. The doors slid open. Wyatt stepped inside. He finally turned to look at her. She stood rigid behind the marble island, her armor perfectly in place, surrounded by millions of dollars of empty space. "See you Monday, Miss Harper," he said. The doors closed, cutting off her face. The descent made his stomach drop, but the real nausea came when he stepped out onto the street. The city smelled of exhaust-hot garbage and wet pavement. It smelled like reality. Monday morning tasted like bile. Wyatt swiped his badge at the turnstile at exactly 7:55 a.m. The light flashed green. He walked to the elevator, keeping his head down, blending into the herd of caffeinated, anxious employees. The fourth floor was identical to how he had left it. The sickly fluorescent lights buzzed. David was already at his desk, rhythmically chewing on a green plastic stir stick, staring dead-eyed at a spreadsheet. "Morning," David mumbled. "Heard the servers actually stayed up all weekend. Miracle?" "Yeah," Wyatt said, dropping his backpack beside his chair. "Miracle." He logged in. His hands were shaking. He expected an email from HR. He expected security to march down the aisle. He expected the other shoe to drop because Sloane Harper did not leave loose ends. Hours dragged by. 10 a.m., 1 p.m., 3:30 p.m. Nothing. Wyatt was typing a string of SQL code when the temperature on the floor seemed to drop 10 degrees. The ambient noise of 80 people typing and talking simultaneously died out in a localized wave. He didn't have to look up to know she was there. He could smell the bergamot cutting through the scent of burnt break-room coffee. Sloane was walking down the main aisle. She never came to the fourth floor. Her heels clicked against the thin industrial carpet with the measured, terrifying cadence of an executioner. Flanked by her executive assistant and the head of data security, she looked untouchable. She stopped 3 desks away, pointing at a terrified junior analyst's screen, asking a rapid-fire question about latency speeds that the kid fumbled to answer. Wyatt kept his eyes glued to his monitors. His heart was a jackhammer in his chest. "You will not look at me differently." She moved closer. She was right behind David's chair. Wyatt could see the edge of her black blazer in his peripheral vision. "Mr. Hayes!" Sloane's voice cut through the air. Wyatt froze. He slowly turned his chair. "Yes, Miss Harper." Her eyes were completely dead. They were the eyes of a shark. "The localized failure last Wednesday. I need the raw logs from your terminal, not the filtered reports, the raw data." I submitted them to the central server on Thursday morning," Wyatt said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I prefer hard copies for my personal review," Sloane said. She reached into her blazer pocket. She pulled out a sleek silver flash drive and set it on the edge of his desk. Her fingers brushed against a stack of post-it notes, millimeters from his hand. "Transfer them to this. Have it brought up to my office. Floor 80. 5 o'clock. "Yes, ma'am," Wyatt said. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was professionally appropriate. In that second, the shark eyes vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic scream that only he could hear. Then she turned and walked away, her entourage scrambling to keep up. David let out a long whistle, spitting his stir stick into the trash. "Dude, what did you do to get on her radar? She looked like she wanted to dissect you." "Just unlucky, I guess," Wyatt muttered. He picked up the silver flash drive. It felt incredibly heavy. He plugged it into his tower. A single file window opened. There was no folder for server logs. There was only one document on the drive. It was a PDF. The title read, "Non-disclosure, _agreement, _Harper, _Hayes, .p, DF Wyatt, clicked it open. His blood ran cold. It was 20 pages of dense, suffocating legalese. It stipulated that Wyatt Hayes was permanently forbidden from discussing, documenting, or implying any personal interaction with Sloane Harper. It covered physical encounters, digital communications, and verbal conversations. And at the bottom, there was a compensation clause. In exchange for the signing of this agreement, the sum of $250,000 will be deposited into the account of Wyatt Hayes. Wyatt stared at the screen. $250,000. It was a staggering sum of money. It was Toby's college fund. It was a house in a safe neighborhood. It was the end of the clanking radiator, the cheap groceries, and the terrifying math of living paycheck to paycheck. It was also a gag order. It was her buying her way out of the emotional mess she had initiated. It was a stark, brutal confirmation that to Sloane Harper, he wasn't a person. He was a liability that needed to be zeroed out on a spreadsheet. A deep, ugly rage ignited in Wyatt's chest. He didn't print the server logs. He ejected the drive, shoved it in his pocket, and stood up. At exactly 4:55 p.m., Wyatt stepped off the elevator onto the 80th floor. The air up here was different, silent, heavily filtered, smelling of lemon polish. The executive assistant at the massive mahogany desk eyed his frayed collar with thinly veiled disgust. "Wyatt Hayes, Ms. Harper requested a drive drop-off," he said. The assistant pressed a button. "Go ahead, she's expecting you." Wyatt opened the heavy oak doors to Sloane's office. It was less an office and more a command center. Sloane was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis she essentially owned. She turned around as the doors clicked shut. She looked exhausted. Wyatt didn't speak. He walked across the expanse of Persian rug, pulled the silver flash drive from his pocket, and tossed it onto her massive glass desk. It skittered across the surface, hitting her customized Mont Blanc pen holder with a sharp clack. Sloane looked down at the drive, then up at his face. "Did you read it?" "I read it," Wyatt said. His voice was a low, vibrating growl. $250,000. That's a generous severance package for a typo. It's not severance. "You keep your job," Sloane said, stepping away from the window. "It's security. For both of us. You get financial stability for your son. I get the assurance that my board of directors doesn't find out I lost my mind in a subordinate's apartment." "You want to buy my silence," Wyatt said, stepping closer to the desk. "You want to turn what happened into a transaction, because transactions are the only thing you understand." Sloane's jaw tightened. "I understand risk management, Wyatt. You are a risk. I am a risk. This entire situation is a catastrophic liability. I'm not signing it." Sloane froze. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic breaking through the ice. "Wyatt, don't be stupid. That money changes your life. It fixes your problems." "It fixes your problem," Wyatt shouted, slamming his hand down on the glass desk. The thick glass shuddered. "It lets you sleep at night, knowing you boxed me up and put me in a neat little legal cage. I'm not taking your money, Sloane. I don't want your money." He rounded the desk, invading her space, just like he had in the penthouse. She retreated until her back hit the window. "Then what do you want?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell me what you want, Wyatt, because I am losing my mind." "I want you to be a human being." He breathed, stopping inches from her. He could smell the bergamot, the expensive wool of her suit, and the sharp scent of her fear. "I want you to look at me and admit that for 5 minutes on Saturday night, you weren't a CEO, and I wasn't a data architect. We were just two miserable people trying not to drown." Sloane looked up at him. The mask was completely gone. Her lips parted, her chest heaving. She looked terrified, fragile, and utterly cornered. "I can't," she whispered, a tear spilling over her lower lash line, ruining her immaculate makeup. If I take this armor off Wyatt, they'll tear me to pieces. The board, the competitors, the press. I have to be untouchable. Nobody is untouchable, Wyatt said softly. He didn't kiss her this time. He just reached out his rough, calloused thumb, gently wiping the tear from her cheek. She leaned into his palm, a microscopic surrender that felt heavier than a signed contract. Keep the drive, Wyatt said, stepping back. The sudden distance between them felt cold. I won't tell anyone. I won't ruin your empire, but I won't let you buy me either. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Wyatt. He stopped his hand on the brass handle. Toby, Sloane said, her voice trembling slightly. You said he needed new sneakers. Wyatt looked back over his shoulder. She was standing by the window looking small and lost amidst the glass and steel of her own making. He does, Wyatt said cautiously. There's a diner, 3 blocks from your apartment. The one with the broken neon sign, Sloane said, swallowing hard, her eyes darting away from his before meeting them again. I have a gap in my schedule tomorrow night. At 7. I could, hypothetically, bring a pair of shoes. Size 2, correct? Wyatt stared at her. The billionaire CEO of Vanguard Logistics offering to meet him in a greasy spoon diner with a pair of kids' sneakers. It was absurd. It was dangerous. It was completely insane. A slow, cynical, exhausted smile broke across Wyatt's face. Size 3, Wyatt corrected softly. He's growing fast. Sloane nodded once, a stiff, awkward jerk of her head. Size 3, 7 o'clock. Wyatt pushed the door open. Don't wear the cashmere, Sloane. The booths are sticky. Tuesday evening smelled of frying oil and old coffee. Wyatt sat in the back booth of Mike's place, nervously peeling the label off a damp bottle of cheap beer. The diner was a relic, a holdout against gentrification, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. At 7:02 p.m., the bell above the door jingled. Sloane walked in. She hadn't worn the cashmere. Instead, she was wearing a dark, oversized wool sweater and simple black jeans. Her hair was down, falling in loose, imperfect waves around her shoulders. She still looked like a millionaire, but she no longer looked like an executioner. She spotted him and walked over, sliding into the red vinyl booth opposite him. The vinyl squeaked loudly. She winced. She placed a plain brown paper bag on the Formica table. Wyatt pulled the bag toward him. He opened it. Inside was a pair of name-brand durable sneakers. Size 3. There was no receipt. Thank you, Wyatt said, his voice quiet. Sloane looked around the diner, her eyes wide, taking in the laminated menus, the grizzled cook behind the counter, the smell of burnt bacon. I haven't been in a place like this since college. It builds character, Wyatt said, taking a sip of his beer. A waitress in a stained pink uniform walked over, snapping her gum. What can I get you, hon? She asked Sloane, oblivious to the fact that she was speaking to a woman whose net worth rivaled small nations. Just water, please, Sloane said politely. Tap's fine. Tap is fine. The waitress walked away. Sloane looked back at Wyatt. The silence stretched between them thick and awkward. Without the adrenaline of a crisis or the shield of a corporate office, they were just 2 people sitting in a diner, painfully aware of the massive, unbridgeable chasm between their lives. This doesn't fix anything, Sloane said suddenly, her voice low. This doesn't mean we are dating. This doesn't mean the power dynamic is erased. I know, Wyatt said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the sticky table. It's a disaster waiting to happen. If anyone finds out I lose my job, you get a PR nightmare. Exactly, she agreed, tracing the rim of the water glass the waitress had slammed down in front of her. It is highly illogical. The risk-to-reward ratio is entirely skewed. Wyatt watched her fingers against the glass. He remembered how they felt, pulling at his hair. "So, why are you here, Sloane?" he asked softly. She stopped tracing the glass. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. The severe, untouchable CEO was gone. In her place was a woman who was tired of being alone, terrified of the world she had built, and inexplicably drawn to a man who saw right through the armor. "Because," Sloane whispered, a sad, self-deprecating smile touching the corners of her mouth, "my inbox is full of 1,000 messages from people who want my money, and the only message I actually care about is a typo from a guy who couldn't afford the data plan to send it." Wyatt laughed, a genuine chest-deep sound that surprised him. He reached across the table. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He simply laid his hand palm up next to her water glass. Sloane stared at his hand. The calluses, the fading scar near his thumb. She hesitated for a long, agonizing second, the last remnants of her self-preservation fighting a losing battle. Slowly, carefully, she slid her hand across the formica. Her soft fingers slid over his rough palm. He closed his hand gently around hers, anchoring her to the table, to the diner, to reality. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The rent was still due. The board of directors was still waiting. The worlds they lived in were still violently incompatible. But as the neon sign outside buzzed and the smell of frying oil filled the air, Wyatt looked at the billionaire across the table and realized that for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was completely empty. That's the brutal, messy reality of an accidental text to the boss. No perfect fairy tales here. Just two flawed people colliding in a world of corporate armor and unpaid bills. If you loved this deep dive into raw tension, sensory details, and cynical romance, hit that like button right now. It helps the channel grow and tells me you want more grounded, intense stories just like this one. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a good billionaire meets reality drama, and subscribe so you never miss our next emotional roller coaster. Thanks for watching.